Hello. So welcome everyone. Welcome to our program, Death, Dying and the Coming Times. It's the first in a series of conversations about the area of universal and personal relevance. Our program today is a topic that we may have many questions, interests, or even some misapprehensions about. Well, for instance, like Woody Allen, who famously said, "I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens." So, well, we have to help today with this type of quandary. We have two very extremely experienced spiritual explorers, Judy Johnson and Neville Hodgkinson. I'll first introduce Neville, actually. I've known Neville for many years, actually. He's a writer and a journalist. And it's quite interesting that from the early 1980s, he's been a student and teacher of meditation and spiritual philosophy. And it's quite interesting that he's been one of the original founders of the Global Retreat Centre in Oxford. He tells me that his most recent book, a very appropriately title for this particular talk, is called "I Know How to Live, I Know How to Die." And it's about the teachings of the late Daddy Yankee, the director of the Brahmakumaris for many years. So that's Neville. Our co-speaker, our co-angel is Judy Johnson. Now, for 35 years, Judy has worked as a facilitator and coaching consultant in experiential learning, leadership, development and organizational effectiveness. Now she works with government, private community-based organizations locally and internationally. She's the author of 5 books, and at the present time, she coordinates the activities of the Brahmakumaris in Halifax, Canada. Now, both speakers, what they're going to do today for our program, they will share for about 15 minutes each, and then open up into a more open dialogue and conversation. So very much we'd like to start now with Neville.
Hi, hello. Hello everyone, and thanks for the introduction, Jim. You've taken some words out of my mouth, actually. I love that Woody Allen quote about not being afraid of death, just don't want to be there when it happens. I think probably a lot of people do have an underlying fear of death, and it leads us actually to sort of sweep a lot of reality under the carpet. And the more we do that, the more the fear of the ultimate departure grows. I think a successful life is one in which we, by the close of it, we have learned enough about ourselves and about life to move off with ease. But there's an awful lot about the nature of today's world that traps us in a false consciousness, a false sense of identity. And the identity is very much bound up with the body and its possessions and its position in the world, its relationships. And so because we confuse all of those things with who we are, it feels as if it would be a dreadful loss when we go. In fact, some years ago, I was working as a science correspondent on one of the newspapers in London. And I wrote about these young men who wanted to bring body freezing from America. There was a setup in America where you could have your whole body frozen. The idea was that if you went into deep freeze just before you died, then in 50 years' time, you could be woken up, and at that point, there might be a cure for what it was that was about to kill you. And I remember that there was there were 2 options with this company. One was whole body freezing, and the other one was that you just freeze your head. and have that preserved, and then you would sort of have a new body that hopefully the science would advance enough that your head could be grafted onto a new body when the science had moved forward. And the young men who wanted to start this operation in London, I remember their reasoning very clearly, and I sympathized with them. They said it seems such an incredible waste that we should spend our lives learning how to live and then have to leave everything. Everything finishes. So they wanted to sort of create immortality through these technical means. And as far as I know, I think it's a bit of a pipe dream, even though it's quite an attractive idea for some, and especially the wealthy ones. I must give you one little detail that the guy who was leading the operation in this country, at least, I don't think it ever actually really got going. He'd gone over to the American headquarters of the body freezing company, and he told me how they'd taken him up these metal steps by a huge tank where there was swirling frozen gas, liquid nitrogen, I think. And they kind of peered through the mist as he got to the top of the tank and saw these heads bobbing around in the tank. It was quite bizarre. But you know, those jokes around death and the efforts to postpone it. There's a lot of work going in at the moment by some very wealthy people, very wealthy Americans, into methods of prolonging life. They think that they might be able to allow us to live to 150 years, but it would probably only be for the very wealthy. There is actually evidence from science that the full lifespan of a human being, if in absolutely ideal conditions, no stress, no pollution, just a pure, absolutely joyful life, that we would live to about 150. And some scientists are working on trying to make that happen. But I'm not sure that I really want to be dragged out beyond what might be my natural time in today's world with weird methods like those. But this kind of nervousness is real around death. And actually, as well as Woody Allen, another one who made a joke of it that I came across recently was Bob Hope, who said that his wife had asked him, when you die, do you want me to arrange for you to be cremated or buried? And he sort of looked reflective for a moment. He said to his wife, surprise me. So, you know, the jokes are legion, but the fear is real, if for many, because of this oddity, this outrageous idea, which unfortunately materialistic science has made very widespread, that it's the end of us when we die. I used to subscribe to that. I used to think that materialistic ways of going about finding about reality were the best way forward for humanity, that spiritual ideas, religious things were just pipe dreams that had led us to, it put us in a lot of trouble actually. And I thought nice, clean information from science is our best way forward. But actually, over many years now of studying with the Spiritual University, I've realized that it's a very toxic belief system that tells us that everything finishes when this body finishes. It arises from the idea that consciousness is a product of the brain. And yet there's very powerful evidence now from many different quarters that consciousness actually lies at a deeper level. Of course, there's an element of consciousness that is produced by the brain. Witness the change of consciousness that happens if you take certain drugs or get hit on the head with a hammer. But there's a deeper level to consciousness, which indicates that actually we are immortal. We are immortals. You know, a bit like I think it would be wonderful if the Marvel Comics people instead of making a superhero series about people with these amazing powers like the Hulk or, you know, whoever, if they made a series about the immortals, because that actually is much closer to truth. And many people have intimations of immortality, but the zeitgeist in today's world, the materialistic focus that tells us that we're just lumps of matter who happen to have developed consciousness, that is so strong that, you know, when people get these intimations of immortality, they're told, oh, don't be silly. That just doesn't exist. And that reminds me of another joke to put on the table for you, since Jim stole my Woody Allen quote. It's the story of a mum. There's a mother, and she's got twins developing in her womb, twin fetuses, and they're quite advanced in their development. They're having a chat, and one of them is quite spiritually minded. You know, it's got a kind of religious-minded fetus, and it says, you know, I just can't believe that everything finishes when we leave this place. And the other fetus is materialistic minded, sort of scientific, logical minded, and says, oh, don't be so silly. After all, nobody's ever come back. You know, this sort of pinpoints an argument that is very common in science, that everything finishes when death occurs. But there's so much evidence that goes against that now. Of course, I'm sure you will have heard about the near-death experience. There are thousands of these accounts now because of improvements in resuscitation techniques. Some cases, people have been gone for many minutes, sometimes even hours, and they're brought back and they describe the experience of going beyond the body again and again and again. There's a commonality to these experiences. There was a Dutch cardiologist, Pim van Lommel, who wrote a whole book about it after doing a 10-year study where he recruited many colleagues to interview heart attack patients who had died clinically, but who were brought back, and that they refer to sort of seeing the surgeons and the doctors running around. Their consciousness expands. They can even see relatives in different parts of the hospital worrying, and they feel completely at peace themselves. And then they often talk of a life review where some kind of realization of unfinished business, perhaps they hurt someone badly, but they'd never acknowledged it, that can come to mind. And then often the sense of moving through a tunnel into a realm of light where they just feel as if they're still an entity, but they're not the body. They're a part of something greater. They feel connected to a realm of consciousness where there are other entities and they are an entity, and yet everything is one in the sense of its connectedness. And there's just a tremendous sense of love and peace within that dimension. And when I first heard about these things, I was very confused because of my materialistic minded outlook that I had previously. But the more I've studied this, and I've looked into how modern physics too is saying that actually the physical world is really a projection of consciousness. Even our bodies, the miracle of our bodies come about because of the immensely refined information that is organizing matter into the trillions of cells, each of which is like a little city in its own right, but trillions of cells that make up my physical being. And we know perfectly well that when death approaches, most people have had the experience of many people at any rate, especially hospice workers, have had the experience that when death approaches, there are what's called deathbed experiences, where even before the person, the entity, this spiritual entity that's the real self, even before that entity has left the body, has died, they speak of being visited, of visiting themselves, these other realms. They have people come and speak to them. These deathbed experiences have been the subject of a number of books recently. There's a very well-known psychiatrist, Dr. Peter Fenwick, who has made a special study of them. And then the whole body of work from the near-death experiences, where people actually die clinically. They can be shown to have no functions remaining. The heart has stopped, the circulation has stopped. In some circumstances, it's even shown that there's no brain activity remaining. And yet the individual has often, they feel called to come back because of some unfinished business. And when they do, they've lost all fear of death. They've had such a clear experience of this realm beyond. Anita Mojani, one of the authors of one of these books on near-death experience, I think I've forgotten the title of her book now. It was something like Dying to Be Me. That was it. A Hong Kong businesswoman, and she'd had cancer. It was eating her up. She'd had it for a few years. She went into a coma. The doctors had almost given up on her. She died. And when she was beyond, in this state, right beyond the body, she realized that she had been living in a way that made her life so uncomfortable and was making the life of others uncomfortable too, because of the narrowness with which she was living, the materialistic way she was living, where ambition and greed and success were so important to her. And the realization was so deep that the vision of this widened consciousness, she said it was like being in a hangar or some huge storeroom, and suddenly the lights go on and you see that there's a tremendous amount there. But then when you come back into this body, you only have your particular light, like a little laser, a little torch that allows you to play your particular part. But you know, once you've experienced that wider illuminated consciousness, that this realm of consciousness exists behind and running the material world. It is so beautiful, and it comes through again and again in these accounts. It's completely unscientific to dismiss these things now. Once you kind of study this, and these people who've experienced it directly, and I've not had that powerful one-off experience like when people have died and come back, but through spiritual teachings and study and meditation practice, and the company of yogis from India who have spent a lifetime developing this awareness that they are much more than the body, that they are not the body, that they are a consciousness that plays a part through the body. Through these different practices, I've come to lose my fear of death as well. I don't mind being there when it happens. So Judy, how about yourself? Does that make any sense? Do you think that will make sense to our viewers and listeners?
Absolutely, Nev. I think it's wonderful. Thank you for that. Really, the science is really helpful at this point for all of us. I really appreciate that you keep your eye on that and you bring it to us and blend it with spirituality so we get both. It's very helpful. Thank you. And good catch on the, yeah, he took your joke and you came in with good one. So hi, everyone. And thanks to Jim for the invitation to be here. I was thinking about how I'm definitely not an expert on this subject because I have not had a death experience that I remember. So I really, the only thing I can share is my own experience of other people's death experience. And and I thought I would bring three stories today to add to what Nev's begun in this exploration today around death and dying. And I think the first one is a personal story. My mom died when I was 5. And as an adult, you know, for the last 55 years, anytime someone would say to me, oh, with any amount of compassion, oh, your mother died, that must have been really hard. I would say something like, oh, you know, no big deal. You know, people die, whatever. Very harsh, very unappreciative, I suppose, unkind in a way, ungentle. And it's only when I turned 60 a couple of years ago that it came home to me how significant it really was, actually, for this little 5-year-old. And it's my first memory of a death experience. And I remember being at the funeral, I guess. I had my best dress on, the one that twirls. And I was sitting in our family home in the living room, and all the men were there. And I remember it was very black because they were all wearing their suits. And I mostly saw the knees, and they had well-pressed pant legs, you know, and it was really heavy and sad and awful, basically. And I remember looking at my dad. His head was down, and he looked lost. I think lost is the best word. And I went into the kitchen where the women were. And they must have been wearing black, I'm sure, but all I remember is the bright red lipstick they were wearing at that time, and Pyrex casserole dishes, and lots of conversation and movement and activity. And it was at that moment I looked around and realized my mom wasn't there. And that's when I realized she was gone. But for this little 5-year-old inquiring mind, it stuck with me for a long time. I was so confused and I was so frustrated that nobody would speak to me about this. And in those days, the 50s, 60s, to be fair, I don't think anybody spoke about death. And I don't think they had much to speak about except euphemisms like, oh, she passed, or she's gone to heaven, or she's an angel now, or none of that made any sense to me. And I think from confusion to frustration to anger. So I think I became a pretty avid student of the death experience from that moment onward. And as a person, it's really only in the last 2 years that I have come to that point in the grieving process where you accept. I think I was in anger and probably a little bit of depression for most of my life in relation to that theme. So one of the themes I'd like to raise is the importance of doing it well. Both for the person who's doing it and for the ones left behind. In this case, a little 5-year-old girl who's now a 62-year-old woman and just sorted it out, hopefully, knock on wood. So that's my first story. Second story, my best friend died 5 years ago. And I use the word best friend, which feels very kind of childish because she was my best friend in grade 4. When we were 9 or 10 years old. And at that time, you had a best friend. You claimed a best friend. So she's sort of always been my best friend. But for all my life, this person has been a best friend, my best friend. We shared all the firsts together, the first kiss, the first job, the first kid, all these things. So she'd been part of my life and I part of hers for ever, a long time. She died 5 years ago, and I was on the other side of the world. I knew she had entered the palliative stage. And I flew from across the world because I knew it was getting close. And it was a long flight. I had about 20 hours to think about this. And on the flight, I reminisced, I wrote, I remembered all of our moments together, significant times, everything. And I had this idea when I arrive, we'll reminisce, and we'll farewell in the way that I had imagined. And of course, was I naive? I got there, I opened the door, you know, instantly I could tell, no, we're way past this stage. This isn't storytelling stage. And the room was silent, you know, kind of like in a church or in one of our meditation rooms, the BK Center. And I could see she was propped up on a bed and her body had withered. So it didn't look like her in terms of body. And you could kind of see she was quite disconnected from her own body. Her face was skeletal. And, but the one thing I noticed was how fierce, how alive her eyes were. And I sat down next to her and I realized we're not telling stories. I'm just going to accompany her. And she was in still some pain, but not a lot. And she kind of whispered to me, Jude, do a meditation. And she had at some point in, you know, at the last 20 years gone to the BK Center because she knew I was studying with the BKs. And so she knew she was a soul. She'd had the sort of basic idea and she believed it. And she also very much believed in rebirth. I knew that about her. She loved this idea. So I sat next to her and I spoke this extended meditation. It must have gone on for half an hour. And, you know, we imagined her leaving her body as this little point of light and being in the light and being so fulfilled and so happy. And then even going into the next, into the womb, into a little baby, being soaked in love, and parents who adored her and welcomed her into the world and held her close and loved her, because it's not something she'd had in this life. So we kind of, knowing her as well as I did, sort of did a commentary that led her through to the ideal outcome. And it was such a great closure for me to see her off happily, but she fell asleep. You could just tell the pain disappeared. She fell asleep and she left shortly thereafter. So the little 5-year-old girl who had a pretty rotten ending experience with the mom had this wonderful ending experience with the best friend, which was really great for me. But what it showed me, because I'd been meditating at that point for 20 years, and we have this idea of dying alive, which I just thought was the weirdest thing. And it took me years to kind of get my head around it. And I realized what my friend had done was she had gone through all the steps, the transitioning that I actually practice in my meditation every single day. That she had withdrawn her attention from her body, that she had even emotional, there was sort of zero affect. The emotions weren't any anymore, you know, and I don't even think she was thinking. She was just present. And I could tell by the life in her eyes that it's like she'd concentrated all her life energy behind her eyes, which is what I do when I meditate, which is what most students of the BKs do when they meditate. And I realized, oh, that's what dying alive is. Every time I meditate, I'm actually practicing this sequence, withdrawing my attention from my body. I always deep breathe and then I relax and I kind of just give the body a break because I don't need it while I'm meditating. And then I settle any emotions, which are typically heart pounding, you know, where you feel them. And then I come to my thoughts, I go behind my thoughts and I focus on the point. And then I transcend. I know I'm still in my body, but I go into the light. And I have that experience. And those are my best meditation experiences. So that was kind of a wake up for me, seeing that. So that's story number 2 is, this is what the meditation process does. It actually takes you to that point. And why not practice it in advance? Wouldn't that be great to do it well? And I suspect some of our fear of death is that either we don't remember doing it for those that are open to rebirth, or we didn't do it very well. So I'd be happy to do it well this time. And I feel that the meditation is a practice in that. So that's the second story. And the third story is a friend of mine is a palliative care chaplain here at the Tertiary Care Hospital in Halifax. And so we've had tea over the years lots of times, and he's been with hundreds of people who have left their bodies, have died. And so he has many stories to tell. And I've learned a lot from him. But 2 of the biggest things that I've learned from him were very helpful for me as a meditator. He's currently writing a book about MAID, medical assistance in dying. And he's writing this book not from a moral or ethical perspective. He's writing it from a spiritual perspective, because having watched all these people leave their bodies, he's not the physician. He is the chaplain. He's the one who sort of responds to their spiritual needs and watches what happens to the human spirit in the dying process. And his feeling is that death is actually the time. It's a process where we come into the experience of the totality of self, and that the medical assistance in dying would actually deprive a person of that completion experience, of that experience of the totality of themselves, which I find fascinating. So I'd like to share with you two things that I learned from him. So the first thing, you can go lots of places and hear the traditional transition stages in the dying process. Many of them are connected to the body, you know, what happens, some of them to the emotions. But I found his 3 stages really, really useful, and I could relate to them as a meditator. So the first stage from his experience is what he calls integration. And he said, the minute somebody gets a diagnosis that they're about to die, and that it will be they will go through the process of leaving their body over time. He said, the minute the diagnosis occurs, people have immediate, he says, it's like anything that you've stuffed in the subconscious basement of the soul emerges immediately to get you to pay attention to it. So it's the time where we actually have to integrate all of our experiences, all of my personality traits, all of my relationships, everything I've ever done or stuffed in the subconscious. It comes out, and sometimes quite intensely, in order to be he called it integrated, which I find a more pleasant experience than what we might say at the Brahma Kumaris. We would say karmic settling. It would be a settlement. I would have to settle. And I kind of like this idea that I'm integrating everything that's ever happened to me, everything I've ever done. And as Nev referred to, it's part of the life review process anyways. So people who get this diagnosis do it, and it's part of their experience in the first phase. And he said, basically, we have to accept and acknowledge everything. The second stage, he said, and this one really intrigues me, he calls it, he called it, and I wrote it down somewhere, reunited, reunited. He says that the second stage that the soul goes through is they have to reunite with their body. He says soul and body, he's Lutheran with a Buddhist practice. So he says mind and body. I would say soul and body, but that soul and body have to reunite. And he said the mechanism for that reuniting experience is pain. And he said pain has the exquisite capacity to focus the attention of the mind. And so it seems unlikely to me, why is it that we would fuse our connection, soul and body, at a time when we're leaving it? It didn't really make sense to me. So I asked him further about it. And I guess I make sense of it now in a way that it's sort of like my final relationship, and my oldest relationship is my relationship with my body. And in a way, the soul has to pay attention to it before leaving it. It's kind of like giving it the attention, the care that maybe I didn't before. I don't know. It'll be different for each of us. But yeah, so this reuniting, and it's pain. And that's the part we all like to skip. And he said that, you know, that part's different for everybody. And it's different depending on how quickly you surrender to the pain, how quickly you surrender to this part of the process. So I'll move on to my last bit. And the third step, he calls it union, and this is the ecstasy stage. And he says that the same hormones in the brain that are present during the pain experience are the same hormones during the ecstasy experience. And so the final of the 3 steps in the soul experience is ecstasy. And that's where we transcend the physical. That's where we go beyond the worldly experience, like my friend had done when I arrived, and many people in their final stages, they're so beyond this physical world, they're not connected to it at all. And that is the stage where people have experienced the near death, where everything is united, everything is connected, everything is one, and I am one with everything. There's no room for ego in that experience. There's no sense of separation. There is just love, love, love. He's not afraid of death because he had a near-death experience, and he knows what's on the other side, love. That's what everybody reports when they come back from their near-death experience, that expanded consciousness where you include everything in your awareness. And so, yeah, that's why he's writing this book about MAID, because he doesn't think we should be deprived of that integrative experience, that experience of ecstasy. So the second thing that I learned from him, and this was about how to be with someone who is dying. He laughs and says, well, my rule of thumb is don't say anything unless it will improve on the silence. So that's his rule of thumb when with someone who's dying, which I thought was great. He said, but the other thing is the biggest disservice we do to each other in the dying experience is we try and protect each other from any messiness. We try to kind of keep it together. He says the very best thing you could do for someone is if you're falling apart, fall apart in front of them. You know, he said, because what it does, and these are his words, which I love, he says, your trembling words will give them the gift of vulnerability. And he says, if vulnerability can be present between you, then you can also talk about dying. He says, the most healthy thing is to say, you're dying. I love you. This is hard. I am so happy I'm here. And he says to say that to the other, but to say it to yourself as well. And the second thing he said, if those words of vulnerability can be spoken, then at some point in the process, what we need to say to each other is, I love you, thank you, I forgive you, goodbye. And those things we need to say to myself and to the other. And finally, his kind of cliche, one of the statements he says all the time, which I think is wonderful. He said, our relationships are the only clothing we wear to heaven. So let's press them up, he says to people. And then he says, you look fabulous. So those are the words of my dear chaplain, palliative care chaplain friend, David, which I have found really helpful as I am with others who are dying, and hopefully I'll apply them to myself when it's my turn to go. So over to you, Nev. Bit of a mouthful. I hope it wasn't too much of a ramble. Now I'm not.
Hello, yes, I'm unmuted now. Hi, thanks, Judy. That was wonderful, actually, because you know, when I'm sharing about the science and the journey that I've been on from being so materialistic in my outlook, and yet wanting to know at a deeper level, to feeling that I do now understand that I am a part of that divine realm, and that I'm an entity that continues when this particular incarnation has finished. I am an immortal, as all of us are. But the stories that you just told really bring home in a practical way. For example, how beautiful that statement about don't say anything unless it adds to the silence. Because it's that a person who is about to leave the body, the integration comes through silence. Mm-hmm. That I'm clear on. Although, you know, I haven't been with someone when they've left, and I'm really pleased to hear about that tip. Otherwise, my own insecurities might have led me to speak in ways that wouldn't have added to the silence. Mm-hmm. But I do have a couple of stories of my own in relation to this. One from when I was in my late teens, and I was close to my grandfather. We lived with my grandparents on my father's side, and I had probably my closest childhood relationship on the male side, certainly, was with my grandpa. I used to, when he was getting old, I used to help him traveling up to London to tend to, he had a gents outfitters shop, and I used to help there and help him in his garden. We lived with him in his place. And something had happened to me in my teenage years where I think I went into some kind of, I don't know, it's some kind of denial of myself, of life, I mean, I was a fairly normal teenager in many respects, but I remember he sort of disappeared from the home. He'd become senile, and then he disappeared, and a few months later, I didn't see him wherever he'd gone. He must have been to an old people's home. My parents didn't take me. I didn't ask to go. And then a master at school said, had seen a notice in the paper that this George Hodgkinson death notice. And he said, is it a relative of yours? I said, no. But I knew that it was at one level, but I wasn't acknowledging it. And he sort of just disappeared. And then years later, I was actually a sub-editor on the Times. You know, sub-editors have this, they like write headlines and cut the stories down to size and check facts, that sort of thing. It's a clerical job in a way, but behind the scenes, not a reporting job. And I was working at the Times in this role, and there was a portly fellow who looked a bit like my grandfather. I only realized that later, who suddenly developed, he was many years older than me, and he suddenly developed liver cancer. He was gone within 3 months. And I went to his funeral. I could not stop crying.
Mm.
I was mourning the loss of my grandfather, and somehow I swept it under the table.
Mm-hmm.
It showed me, you know, the subtlety of these things. Another story to tell you. Jim mentioned at the outset that I'd written that book, I Know How to Live, I Know How to Die, about Daddy Janki's understanding. Daddy means elder sister, and she was the head of the Brahma Kumaris for many years, and my mentor in London for decades. She was a terrific guide and meant an enormous amount to me. One year in India, I was visiting the headquarters in India of this spiritual movement, and I had a dream in which there was a pyramid with stepped sides, and I was standing maybe about halfway up, 2/3 of the way up the side of this, high enough to see her appear at the very top of the pyramid. There was an enormous crowd on the plain down below, waiting to hear from her. And she appeared, and they were all expectantly awaiting her talk. And she sat down on the ground at the top of this pyramid, lay back and left her body. And I just observed this in my dream, because in my dream, it's like I wasn't in the body. I was beyond the body. I was the observing soul. And I just observed, oh, those people down there, they're going to be disappointed. And then I woke up, and as I came back into the body, it was quite extraordinary that suddenly the loss of this person who'd actually been hugely important to me for many years hit me, and I couldn't stop sobbing for about 10 minutes. I woke up, I knew it was a dream, but I couldn't stop sobbing. And then finally, at that time, I realized, because one of the teachings that I really hold dear is that to really release our love, this dying alive process that you spoke of, Judy, the more we succeed in that, the more we will be prepared for death, and the more we will live. we will live good lives, loving lives, the more we die alive. And a part of that is to die from this neediness, this kind of identification with this body, precious, of course, but you know, when I'm in the identity that is too tied in with this body and its needs and the relationships, then when someone faced with the loss of someone with whom there is that intense attachment relationship, there's pain. But when Daddy Yankee actually died some months back, I was, thanks to the intervening time where more of that dying alive has occurred, I just celebrated a wonderful life. She was 104, she was ready to go, and I think she lifted off without pain. I think she had made such a success of her life, such an integration had taken place through her own relationship with herself and with God, because she felt 80 years back, she felt that she had learned about a source of pure consciousness that she felt was making itself known in this world in order to uplift humanity at a time of great need. And this actually brings us on to a part of our program title of Death, Dying and the Coming Times, because she set an example of dying alive to such an extent through study, through relationship with that pure one, that source, through a kind of cleansing of her own consciousness, such that she was able to give endlessly. It didn't mean that, I mean, that you witnessed the fact that she lived to 104. It didn't mean that she was not connected with her body. In fact, towards the end of her time, she came out with a statement that I think was a surprise to many people, because the Brahma Kumaris is called a world spiritual university. But she said the entire work of the Brahma Kumaris is all about the head and the heart. And she meant it physically and spiritually. She said, this heart of mine is filled with happiness, and this head and brain are cool. So there was nothing pulling her. She had died, in a sense, whilst in that body, such that she radiated love. And I know that that is like the truth that people experience when they leave the body and they go into this realm beyond, and they feel that they've met a higher power, some supreme being. So, but she did it while alive, and that allowed her to lift off at death in a completely painless way. What do you think, Judy? I feel as if this is it's a high ideal. It's not that everybody's going to manage that. She had had a lifetime of practice of this. You know, others of us, we're all engaged with children and grandchildren and jobs and all the rest of it. But it seems like a very worthwhile ideal. What do you think?
Thanks, Nev. I love the stories. As I listen to you, I'm struck by how it's like a delayed response that you had. But I'm wondering, and this takes me to Daddy. I'm wondering if we have buried, loss experiences from way back, and there are many delayed reactions to things. And I'm thinking of my friend, the chaplain, who said, what you've stuffed in the subconscious basement is gonna come out. And so best that we get it all out now, and that we face it and we let it go. And I know when I first started with the Brahma Kumaris, I remember thinking they had this quirky little practice where somebody was going somewhere, they had to sit at the front of the classroom and take leave. And I thought this was just the weirdest thing. It didn't make any sense to me, because I was a slip away kind of person. I was like a go out the back and not, just don't pay any attention to me. And I've since learned this practice, but over the years, I think what occurred to me is that this is part of healing something. This is part of doing that sub-basement work of how many times have we lost people without proper goodbyes? Let's say goodbye properly now. Let's do it well. Every encounter and goodbye we say, even if it's a see you tomorrow, let's do it well. Let's do it with dignity. And I feel like that's part of Daddy's practice of leaving. Like, she'd never slip away anywhere. Like, she's just too royal to do that. You know, so there's something about everything we're doing now is part of a practice that is helping us to leave in a dignified way. And, you know, from all the near-death experiences, I feel like what's on the other side is lovely. I feel like this love experience will await all of us. The only question is, we'll each have our different journey towards that light. And the extent to which I can use my time now in a worthwhile way, my attention, my energy in a worthwhile way, to make that journey now lovely, to do that kind of settling or integrating work now. In my meditation practice, to really get to the point of leaving my body rather than still being in it and thinking about my day and my feelings and whatever, you know. And Daddy was our prime example of that, right? She didn't short shrift on any of the practices. Yeah. And so my attention to these practices will, in the moment of departure, I feel, make it quite easy. And I think that's worthy work to do, and it doesn't feel morbid to me at all. I know here we had the Buddhist group here did a program once, and it was called If I Had a Year to Live. And it was their way. People signed up for the program for a year, and they went through all the things that they would have to take care of if in fact they had a year to live. And it was a way to accelerate people's attention to life details, to relationship peace and harmony, to attachments, to ego dissolving. And apparently it was a great program. I didn't go, but I feel like it was a little bit like what we are doing and have been doing, for me for 25 years, for you many more years than me. But I feel like this is what our whole life is. It is truly dying, but still being alive while we do it. Like, go through all those transition stages, but in a very alive way and in a wonderful community.
Yes. You've reminded me of something that that I remember Daddy saying, something along the lines that if you, a life in which, well, and she made this her effort, a life in which you've used your breath, your time, your energy well, death will hold no fears. And this is actually quite an important point, that that attention that you're speaking of to awakening, if you like, to living well, is important in preparing us for our departure from this world. If we were, it's not a question of blame. I saw a wonderful video recently of Gabor Mate, the Hungarian teacher, on trauma and healing, and he's brilliant in explaining that we're a part of an unfolding reality in which good and light and darkness and pain have all been, you know, a part of it for quite a long time. That an abusive parent has been abused themselves. The things go right back. There's no point in finding blame, in looking for reasons in a detailed sense. Just understanding that error and darkness have become a part of life at this time, and that there is an opportunity now to free ourselves from that. It's not something that should be a cause of pressure, but it's a call of the time. That a bit like you're saying, you know, on a daily basis, if you're taking leave, do it with dignity, and a bit like the Gandhian statement, Mahatma Gandhi, who said, something on the lines that study as if you're going to live forever, but live as if you're going to die tomorrow. You know, that so that you're living in ways that are clean, and you're not leaving behind hurt or unfinished business. If you're thinking in those kind of ways, this is all part of dying alive, and I think it would lead to the feeling, death, where is thy sting, as death approached. And that is actually because we're in troubled times. I mean, not everybody would agree with this. Many people are desperately trying to find ways to improve this tired old world. But in the perspective that I now hold, I have a sense that there is a renewal going on, and that spiritual renewal is a part of it. That this renewal of consciousness that comes about as we die to the old, actually brings into being the fresh start, the renewal that is part of life's continuity. Remembering that we're immortals, and yet we go through periods of light and dark. So I feel as if there is a lot of darkness currently, and it's giving rise to the threats to the environment. It's given rise to the COVID crisis. It's given rise to an enormous amount of corruption and foolishness in human behavior. But it will pass, and we can help it to pass to the extent that we emerge that love that you spoke of, which lies behind the pain and the trauma.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right, and I think that the collective trauma, it might be the I saw the Gabor Mate one film that you're referring to, and I found it really helpful to see every individual, with whether it's small or large. I mean, everybody has had something happen to them in their lives, and I feel like we kind of coat it and then bury it, and just in order to cope.
That's the problem.
And so if everybody out there is just coping, and running like mad to cope with what's going on, then where is the space to heal? I don't know that there is a lot of space for that. So I feel like even myself, making space for myself to sit with some of these things, not to think about them, but just to acknowledge that there are things that need to heal and dissolve in order to bring the kind of energy required for renewal. So I feel like you could say we're dying alive now, or you could say we're renewing.
We're renewing.
And I'm happy with either of those. It's probably more refreshing to say we're renewing ourselves, and because at the consciousness level, that is what we're doing. Bodies are getting old. Bodies will continue to get old. Ultimately, this body will go. We know that. But I'm renewing consciousness. And I love the Gandhi's quote about study as if you're going to live forever, because you take your wisdom with you. But of course, live like you'll die tomorrow, because the body could go at any time.
Yes.
Right, could I come in there just to
Sure, Jim.
Ask you guys a question? You've been talking very metaphysically about the whole subject of living and dying, but for most people, it's a very physical, very difficult situation. And one of the big things that goes along with this aspect of dying, especially in the West, is this thing about grief, that when people leave the body, it's almost a kind of, it goes with the territory that they have to grieve. They have to spend a long time kind of regretting or holding on to that individual. What would you say to such a soul? How would you help them? What can we say to such souls who haven't got the spiritual background that you guys have got? What can we do to help and support souls who probably have, not to kind of be in a condescending way, but not having a kind of vast spiritual background of lots of different coping mechanisms? What can we say and do? And secondly, maybe I'm adding a kind of multiple question, is when souls leave the body, how can we support the souls that have gone on? You know, what's the effect of grief here on the soul that has gone on? Is it positive? Is it negative? What's the effect? And what can we do as spiritual people? What can we do to help both sides of the coin?
Perhaps I could offer an answer to the second question first, and then pass the first question back to Judy, because I feel that she has a lot of practical experience in this area. But with regard to the second question and the aspect of someone leaving, I've been to a number of funerals where a sister, you know, one of the dedicated sisters of the Brahma Kumaris has conducted the farewell, and I've seen again and again how relatives who might be otherwise in tears and suffering, when they understand that in a sense the funeral is a source of celebration of a great life, when they recall the beauty of the person and the stories of their life and the treasures of memories that they have with them, and are encouraged by the sister who is like conducting the service, instead of encouraging sorrow, encouraging that celebratory feeling, and actually indicating to the relatives that feeling of appreciation and positive energy is going to help the soul that has passed to leave any residual pulls from their previous relationships and move forward. When all of those things are present, it's a great help to people, even if they don't have any spiritual background or understanding. So there's one thing I would share there.
Thank you, Nev. That's helpful. I think, Jim, the grieving, you've heard some stories from both Nev and I where we actually didn't grieve properly, and so things were left hanging, and later in life coming to some resolution from. So I think it's important to grieve, and I think that we all do it differently, and you can't really determine how someone will grieve. I have a friend here whose mother died and she went off and bought a red sports car. And, when my mom died, my dad went off and signed up for a military research vessel for 6 months and disappeared, which was part of my trauma, being left alone. But for him, I can forgive him years later. That's what he had to do. I don't think we can determine how long or how short a grieving process will be for a person. But I do think that there's something about being able to speak about it and creating an environment where it's natural, it's normal, it's part of the human experience. Let's talk about it. And that can happen very early. I used to travel to India and leave the little kids with their grandma for just a couple of weeks. And, one time I went and the littlest one says, Mom, what do we do if you die? And she was 7. And says, well, Lou, the will is in the top drawer, in the yellow filing. And she go, oh, okay, that's fine. That's all I need to know. It's like a certain level, we all, we're all different, but we thirst for a certain amount of knowledge or understanding. And it's different for all of us. And I think it's just creating an environment whereby those conversations can be had. And
can you say that, that often it's described as that the soul is wanting to go on, yet the grieving partners or body is holding on to the ankle of the person trying to fly off, and so it's kind of the grieving can be detrimental in that particular area. How do we reconcile this, letting the soul go, but actually reconciling and expunging the feelings that we have within ourselves? How do we deal with that kind of paradox?
Honestly, Jim, I think what you're describing is the person left behind isn't grieving, they're attached. and they're not letting go. And that's different. If somebody is still attached, they're going to hang on, they're going to hang on. And actually that delays grieving. That's not the same as grieving. Grieving is when you can honestly acknowledge what your life is going to be like without this person. And if you're a non-identity without this person present, then your whole identity crumbles in their absence. You cannot afford to let them go, right? So the, you know, the courage it takes to face, you know, what you are left with when someone leaves, that's actually grieving. The other that you're describing is just attachment. It's not grieving.
I like that, Judy. And I think it brings us back also to this beautiful idea that we should be living in ways where love is present and not attachment. That is the beauty of this dying alive concept. Dying alive doesn't mean that you're leaving this world. It means that you're dying to those attachments that we have all formed, as Gabar Mete makes so plain, that the traumas of life often have led us to away from the awareness of the real self, the inner being, and identification with the body, with the experiences that we can get through the body, with drugs, with workaholism, with attachments to people, with sexaholics. You know, there's so many different ways whereby we have bound ourselves to the material side, and that is what makes the fear of, that's what creates the intense fear of death, I think. And so I think that especially in this era where it's becoming increasingly difficult to hide from the destructive processes that humanity as a whole have unleashed on this planet, I think it really behoves us to be thinking more and more about how can I live with love, with real love that doesn't seek to bind another, but only to release from within myself that positive energy that comes from the divine. I feel that this is incredibly important for this time. And it's not new. You know, we love the Harry Potter stories, and Harry Potter's the brilliance of those stories was that he had to die in order to fully defeat the forces of darkness. And the Chronicles of Narnia, you know, C.S. Lewis, there's a wonderful quote I've got somewhere about, who was of course an Oxford Don who transformed from being an atheist into a devout Christian. And in Chronicles of Narnia, he wrote, "Give up yourself and you'll find your real self. Lose your life and you'll save it. Submit to death. Submit with every fiber of your being and you'll find eternal life." And I feel that now. It's no longer theory, you know, and I think that all of us do actually. That's why those become such classic stories for us to enjoy, because somehow deep down we all know that we're souls. It's just got hidden by a false story of materialism. And we must learn to reject that, because that false story is the source of so much of our suffering. If we can let go of that, and actually love is the energy that really allows us to let go, then we can bring more love into our lives, we can give more love to one another, and we can move towards a better world. I'm sure of that.
Nev, why don't you take us out with it a little immortal meditation?
The immortals. Yeah, let's have a few thoughts of for closure. And thanks to all of those who have been with this podcast this evening and who may be seeing it in the future. Thanks to Jim and Judy for this chat. Judy, I'll say a few words and then I'll invite you to pick up on it with your meditation practice, which I sense you're very skilled in leading people into this beautiful, subtle, deeper awareness of the inner being. As Gabor Mate has realized, and Louise Hay realized, love is the energy that frees us. And both of them, him with his doleful compassion and Louise Hay with her joy, both are healing workers. And we can all do something similar.
Even if we sit here just for a moment together before we end and absorb some of the wisdom that's been explored here this evening, and just becoming aware of our bodies, be aware that it's a costume, a shell, valuable, precious, and that I am the one within it. I'm just drawing my attention upwards, away from the body and into that subtle being of thought energy. I can lift above this body and look down at it, my mind, and I can even experience the light, the eternal light of love, pulsating in me and around me until I feel like I am one with everything. In our shared journey, yet a very individual experience of it. We are all in the light. Om Shanti. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Nev. Nice to be with you.
Thanks very much. Thanks to our wonderful speakers. I'm sure everyone found it incredibly inspiring and reassuring. And why did you have to finish? I think we could have gone on. I think we're just warming up. So that was wonderful, incredible. Thank you so much for sharing your heart wisdom, really, because I felt it was coming from your heart, really. This wasn't just something from your head. There's something beautiful. So thanks a lot. And if anybody would like to catch up with this program, it's available to watch on Catch Up on the GCH website and many other programs as well. And just to finish, our next conversation in the series will be on the 15th of August, entitled Our Spiritual Journey. So we hope to see you then. So thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great evening. Thanks again to our speakers.